Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this part we're going to be adding some objects or enemies for us to hit inside of our 1-bit projectile platformer 2D Godot tutorial series. So we already have a projectile which is using a rigid body and being affected by physics. There's a couple changes I want to make. First off, I don't want the player to be able to actually physically collide with our projectiles like this. So we can do that just by moving the projectile onto a different layer or moving our player onto a different layer. Than what the collision is occurring here on, which currently is layer 1. So if we make a layer for player and enemy, then we can adjust that accordingly. Okay, so aside from that, for any object in the game we want to be able to be hit and take damage, we should create some kind of damageable component for those scenes. So we might call this something like health, or in other tutorial series I've called it damageable, which would have a health property. And we just need to make sure that anything damageable has that so that our weapons can target the damageable component and deal damage to the health of that component. So let's start off with the first part of making it so that the projectile does not hit the player. If we go to Basic Projectile and we click on the root here, then as a collision object 2D, we can come down here to the collision layers and we can see which layers it interacts on and which layers it interacts against. So the layers it's on is the layer section here, and the layers it connects with is the mask. So we still want it to affect the ground and run into walls and stuff like that. Let's add a couple new layer names. So edit layers. Let's say that layer 2 is player, layer 3 is object, and layer 4 is enemy. Let's also add another one for Hitbox. So when I have a hitbox layer, I'm referring to the area where an attack can hit a target, which could be like a player, an enemy, or an object, but not necessarily the physics layer of that player, object, or enemy itself. So we entirely might have a different collision shape for the hitbox than the collision shape for how the enemy stands on the ground, for instance. So we'll have that be a separate layer. And our projectile can hit both the ground and the hitbox layer. But then this hitbox on each of the characters is probably just going to be an area 2D. So physical interactions like pushing the character out of the way won't occur on the hitbox layer. So let's hit close there, and I think that'll be good for now. So we of course want the projectiles to hit the hitbox like that. And if we go to player, we want to change the player's collision layers from 1 to 2. Now it's still going to mask layer 1 because we still want the player body to land on the ground, so we need that mask of layer 1 on the ground. But if I hit play now, our player can land on the ground, but let's launch some projectiles and our player should just be able to walk straight through it. Now that's not the case, so I messed up a bit somewhere. Let's see what happened. So if we go to projectile, it's still on layer 1. And that's probably the issue. We need to change this to a different layer. Let's edit layer names, and I could say layer 6 is projectiles. And then we move our projectile to layer 6. Okay, so now it's not part of the ground layer, so our player should be able to walk through it. Let's launch some projectiles, and some up there as well. And if I walk through it, okay, there you can see our player can no longer physically interact directly with the projectiles. Now when we add a hitbox of sorts to the player should still be able to be hit. Okay, also on the projectiles, I think I'm going to bump the gravity scale. They do fall just a little too slow. So on the basic projectile, let's take the gravity scale and make that 0.2, hit play, and try again. Yeah, okay, maybe that's a little better. And we'll hit play, try it out, and I think that's a little bit better. You can play around with numbers, so you can just change it to 0.3 in the editor, and now it should already fall faster. So let's go ahead and hit play and shoot a couple of the projectiles, and we can see that they already fall a lot faster, but not nearly as fast as the player does with the 1.0 gravity scale here. So it depends on how floaty you want your physics objects to be. Okay, so now I guess we should add in some kind of targetable enemy to our game so that we can shoot it with the projectile. So let's create a new scene. This will be a 2D scene. I'll change the type with right click to character body 2D. Or platformer character 2D, actually. Since we made the class name, we can actually create the node straight from in here. We don't have to assign the script manually, because when we create as a new platformer character 2D, the custom script we created is already there. So that should be good there, and then we can extend to make it a enemy later on as needed. So let's just call this enemy for now. And I'll right click, add a facing node, because the enemy is going to need to face a certain direction, just like the player. And let's select the enemy as the character node here. And then inside of here, we'll do a animated sprite 2D. So for the animation, sprite frames, new sprite frames, we'll extend this and we'll get like our idle animation or something from the sprite sheet. So let's add from the art, the platformer pack, the frames we want for this enemy. So let's control middle mouse wheel to zoom in. And I think all the characters are down here at the bottom. So let's have in these frames for the walk cycle. Add 4 frames. We'll rename this walk. And then add frames. We'll zoom in and get this one at the end for the dead state. Oh, whoops, I forgot to create a new animation. So Control Z to undo that, add animation. And then we'll rename this death animation, add frames, and grab the one where he's on the ground right there. So for both of these animations, change the FPS to 10 so that it's consistent. And if we go to walk and hit play, we should be able to kind of have our character walking there. Yeah, by the looks of it, we might want to take 2 and Control C to copy it. Go to frame 3 here, paste it in. And then frame 1, copy that to frame 4 and hit paste. Is that better or worse? I'll hit Control Z a couple times. And that looks more sporadic. Obviously, the walking, we're just talking about moving a couple pixels here. It's really as simple as it can get. Yeah, maybe it's just better like this. Just the original 4 frames. So our enemy from the platformer character inherits the move speed and the logic for jumping. Currently, ground jump is set to false, so this character can't jump at the moment. And we have the facing node, so if we need to switch its facing direction, we can do that. Though for this character, we might not even need to because it basically is facing the front. Okay, so for our character to get hit, we're going to need some kind of hitbox node. So I'll right click on enemy and let's add a child node. So I'll right click on facing and add a child node, and let's look for an area 2D node, create that. So an area 2D node has a collision shape just like a physics body, like a character body 2D or a rigid body 2D does. But generally, it's not there to be affected by physics. So if something runs into an area 2D, it tends to just pass through it. But what the area 2D does is has monitoring and monitorable so that it can check if something entered it, or another area could check if this area 2D passed into another area 2D, and that would be the monitorable. Other areas can detect this area, and then monitoring would be able to detect collision bodies or other areas that enter it. Now, when that happens, all of that has to be handled in code. So basically on body entered or on area entered, you do something with that, and that would require you to, of course, create a custom script. So for this, I'm going to rename this to be, let's say, Hitbox2D, and I'll add a script, and we'll attach this to, it's not even really a characters, it's more of a objects kind of thing, because a lot of games these days would also have destroyable environments. So that would be things like boxes or chests or trees. You'd be able to actually damage them as well. So maybe we create an objects folder here, and I might move characters directly into that later. So I'll have objects, hit OK. And then inside of here, hitbox2d.gd. Let's create that script. Okay. And before we start editing that, let's save the enemy scene. So Control S, I'll put it in characters, create a new folders, enemies. And for a name, kind of looks like a Space Invader from like the classic game. So yeah, why don't we just go with invader.tscn. So if we want, we can also move characters into objects. So I'll right click on the folder, do move, duplicate, select objects folder and do move. Make sure it's not copy because that'll duplicate everything. We want to move it. Okay, and now characters is inside of the objects folder, and all of the references inside of the project should kind of update there. It's definitely preferable to use the menu here to move stuff rather than going to the file manager and moving it there. Just because if you move stuff around outside of the Godot engine, who knows what kind of missing references it'll cause for your game. So for our hitbox, rather than reacting to the projectile entering the area, I'll let the projectile detect if it connected with a hitbox, and then read properties from the hitbox in order to deal damage to the enemy object or player. Okay, so in our hitbox class, first I will give the class name Hitbox2D, and then we're going to want it to reference, let's say, the stats of our enemy, which will include the current health of the enemy, which is going to be the stat that we directly try to affect. So in objects, we could right-click and create a new script. Let's make it a resource, and I'll call it object stats. I think that makes sense for now. Okay, and then we expand this. We'll give it the class name object stats. So this is a set of statistics about an object, and what's important to us is probably going to be export var max health, and then we'll have our current health. So for the health values of your game, you can decide if you want to make it a integer or a float. I think most games would just make it an integer, because if you read damage values on the screen and it's something like 0.2 damage or 0.2444 damage, it's kind of hard to understand. So usually full integer values is the way to go. So if we have every object have a default health of 100 before we change it, then we can do that. Probably say that the current health is also an integer. And we are going to want the current health to by default be set to the max health value. So, and we might change this later, but I'll try setting it equal to max health. So kind of when the script loads up by default, the max health should be set to the current health, which is usually what we want. There would be cases where like you load a game and then you want to load that data into this resource and override that value. But you can do that with the load function when you get to saving and loading data, which honestly, probably not part of this tutorial series, but just kind of an idea there. Okay, so in the Hitbox2D now, we need to have a set of object stats, export var object stats, which will be of type object stats. If we click on the hitbox, that's a resource we can create. So new object stats. Now, these stats, we do want to make sure that they are unique to each enemy. So when we are basically creating our object stats here, you don't want to right click and save them to the project and then keep reusing the same resource like we did with these down here, the player import actions and player sprite frames is also a resource. Because we're not reusing them across different enemies. We actually have a local one for each enemy in our game. So if you just leave it right here, then that is going to be local to the scene. And if you need to put it into a different field, but within the same enemy scene, you can right click it and then copy and go over to a different script and then paste it in. And that's still going to reference the same one as far as I remember. So just be aware of that. We're creating a local resource, not one that's global for our project and shared across everything. Now, of course, another object like a UI can get reference to this object stats from the enemy. And that's fine. They can still reuse it in the UI. But you just need to have one per enemy or one per object in your game. And that's the important thing. We have our max health there and our current health. So we should be able to deal damage to the current health. I think I'm actually going to rename the field here just to be stats. And then new object stats. So reason for renaming it just to stats instead of object stats is depending on which kind of character is using this setup, the object stats actually will probably be a parent class to a child class like character stats. Obviously, an enemy is a character and a player is a character too. So we just need some kind of object stats to assign here. Any child class that inherits from here is also assignable here. So just calling it stats makes more sense. Okay, now our Hitbox2D, you can see there's a warning here that we need to have a collision shape. And also, we need a collision shape of the enemy as well. So let's right click on the enemy and create a collision shape 2D. So for our physical collision shape, I might want, let's say, a capsule shape. And let's make it very small. Also, the animated sprite, I'm going to go to that, hit W and move it up here. So remember, I try to make about the feet area where our 0, here is. So wherever we're standing on, that should be about where the feet are located. So either there or like right there. And that's just kind of for consistency between scenes. So let's move the collision shape up and then shrink it to our character size. You can also rotate the collision shape, if I remember right. And then we can move this down and shrink the sides in. Okay, maybe that's fine. So it's like a 90-degree rotated capsule shape, and that basically gives us a sideways egg. And then for the hitbox, let's right click and add a collision shape 2D. So we need to define a shape here as well. If you want, you could actually right click on the capsule shape here, copy that, go to the collision shape 2D, right click, paste it in, and then you have the same shape here. But the transform needs to be set individually. So we could do something like -5 on the Y and then 90-degree rotation. And now we have the same capsule shape being reused across both of these. One's -90 and one's 90. So I might want to change those for consistency. But because this is now a shared resource, I could actually go up here and expand the radius. And you'll see that if I go to the other object which uses this, it has the same radius value, because it's actually being shared locally within the scene. So that's kind of what I meant by the object stats. You'd be able to actually share it the same way by just copy and pasting it within the same scene, and then multiple objects are referencing the same resource, even though it's a local resource and not saved to the project. So let's go with that for now. The hitbox and the collision shape for the enemy itself are both the same, but we have the ability to change it anytime we want. So we could always just assign a custom shape 2D here, and it can be completely different than the physics shape your character interacts with. So now we need to make sure the enemy is actually on layer 3 or layer 4 for enemy. Okay, and the mask should be 1 because the enemy is going to walk on the ground. And you know what? I realized I got the terminology a little bit wrong here. So a hitbox is where you are to actually damage another character. A Hurtbox is where the character can take damage. So I need to rename this to Hurtbox2D. And in the script, we'll also call that Hurtbox2D. And let's rename the script to be Hurtbox2D. So if we had like a melee attack, and it needed to be in a certain zone where it could hit another character, then that would be the hitbox. But this is the Hurtbox because this is where it can take damage. And if we want to, we can also tell the collision shape, Hurtbox shape. Okay, and this can be the physics shape if we so desire. So that, you know, the names actually make it a little bit more specific what's what. And you can hover over the nodes and see how they're named down there. So Hurtbox is, of course, where a object can take damage. Okay, so then for the Hurtbox2D, I did create the Hitbox layer, but let's actually add in a Hurtbox layer as well. And I might want to, while I'm ahead, take projectiles, move that down there, and then put Hurtbox here just so that they're closer together. Okay, so because of that, I'll need to go back to the projectile and make sure it's not on the Hurtbox layer, but the projectiles layer. So once you do name your layers, it's probably a good idea to keep them kind of set in stone so that you don't need to update everything. Otherwise, you'd need to come in here and manually change it. But let's make sure that the mask here can hit the Hurtbox instead of the hitbox. Okay, so our projectile needs to be able to hit a Hurtbox. And since we're doing it the way where the hitbox is going to read the Hurtbox on entering the area, then I guess our projectile doesn't need to have its own Hurtbox area. So if we right click on the basic projectile and add a child node, we'll do a area 2D. And then this one will also have a collision shape 2D. We can copy and paste the same shape from the physics component, copy, into here, just to keep it simple. Then I'll rename this to be Hitbox2D. We'll add a new script, and this will be, Hitbox could just go into weapons. Maybe that makes the most sense. Yeah, okay, well, let's do that. And open, save, give it the class name, Hitbox2D. So this is going to be the area where on entering another Hurtbox area, we can do damage to the object associated with a Hurtbox. So for the Hitbox, we want to connect to its own signals on the node section of on area entered. So let's create a ready function where we connect to area entered dot connect on area entered. Okay, then we need to create the function. So function underscore on area entered, and this gets a area 2D as a parameter. So I'll call it p area of type area 2D, And first we want to check if the area is actually a Hurtbox area. So let's say if not p area is Hurtbox2D, we'll return. So that's just a simple way of skipping the rest of the script unless the condition is met. And then we don't need to keep everything within the if statement as well. So we could just come down here. We verified that the p area is a Hurtbox. So inside of our function, let's convert the p area to a Hurtbox if it is one. So Hurtbox equals p area as Hurtbox2D. So if not Hurtbox, then we're just going to return because we only affect Hurtboxes with our Hitboxes. And since we verified that it's a Hurtbox now, we should be able to do something like Hurtbox.stats. Yep. So we can deal damage to the character. So Hurtbox.stats.current health minus equals, and we would say some kind of damage value here, right? So I guess it would make sense to have, let's say, a weapon stats resource for the projectile or anything else that hits enemies or players or objects. And then we can reference the damage value on that weapon stats. Let's see here. In the weapons folder, we'll right-click, create a new script. I'll call this weapon stats, and it's going to inherit from resource. So the weapon stats, class name weapon stats, pretty self-explanatory. We can give it export var display name, which is going to be a string name. We can give it export var damage. We're just going to make everything an integer in this game, keep it simple, easy to understand. And we could give it a default value if we want, possibly something like 10. And I guess that's all we really need for right now. We can always add stuff to it. So a hitbox now needs to have reference to weapon stats. So at export var, I guess we call it weapon stats here just to be a little bit specific, weapon stats. And then we're going to do minus equals weapon stats dot damage. So our Hurtbox has reference to the stats, and then we take the current health and we subtract the damage of the weapon stats. Make sure there's no diagonal slash there. Okay. Then we need to create a weapon stats inside of our hitbox. So we'll do new weapon stats here, and this will be the basic projectile weapon stats. It'll deal 10 damage. And we will save this to the project in case we need to reuse this. So right click, save as, and weapons. We could say new folder, weapon stats, and then inside of here, weapon stats basic. So that would work okay right here. But we do already have the fireball.gd, which has a display name. So I think it might be a little better even if we do export var stats and then weapon stats in the fireball script. So now if we save that and we expand fireball basic, then we can create a weapon stats inside of here. So new weapon stats. And if we edit the script, we'll just edit again on the script.gd. Then we'll just remove the display name there because I guess the name isn't exactly the stats of the weapon. So we'll keep that separate. Okay. And now our fireball basic has the weapon stats. So anything else that would go in here, like the type of weapon, the damage it deals, maybe a checkbox for if it's over time, that kind of thing, we can all put that inside of here. If you wanted later, you could put a field for the basic projectile to have a reference to the fireball. So like the fireball resource that it was created from, you could put that here. But we don't necessarily have to do that, at least for now. So to make sure that this is the weapon stats from the fireball basic, I'll expand the resource, then I'll give it a name, let's say basic fireball stats. Now if we close this, I'll right click copy this, and we go to the Hitbox2D, I'll paste it in here. Then we can see, okay, it's referencing basic fireball stats. So that's nested inside of our fireball basic, but I think we should still be able to reference that properly. And then we don't actually need to have a external weapon stats because it's already inside of that resource. So I will just delete this folder for right now and just keep it nested inside of one place. Okay, so we have our weapon stats here, and we want to make sure that that's the same weapon stats we use in the Hitbox2D. You can go into here and copy and paste that into the other one, but maybe we want to save this inside our project as well. So for weapon stats basic, I'll overwrite it with this. You might need to actually make it unique first here by right-click, make unique, and then save as in the project. Weapon stats basic will override that. Okay, and then if we click on Hitbox, we need to make sure that's using this. And the fireable basic is also using this. Okay, basically just make sure that they're actually using the same resource. That's the important thing. Now, it's up to you if you want to move this to the projectiles folder. I might actually do that just to keep everything grouped with one scene directly inside of there. And you can still search the project by the name of the resource here. So I'll actually just move that into projectiles. Then I'll create a new folder in projectiles. Let's call this the basic projectile. And I'll move anything that's associated with the basic projectile, that's these three with the basic name, into the basic projectile folder. So the scripts for basically creating a projectile are still up one directory, but the basic projectile associated resources and the scenes are nested in the same area. And as a result, I might not need the weapon stats folder. I'll delete that for right now. We can always recreate it later. And so basically, after playing around with the resources and putting them in the folder and referencing them between our different objects, at the end of the day, all that we're really doing is reading the damage value from this resource and assigning it to the current health of the other resource, which is the stats on the Hurtbox. So to test that that's working, let's hit a breakpoint and add one of these invaders to the level 1. So in level 1, let's search for invader. I'll zoom out a bit. Let's add this guy over there. Let's add one above the ground and just make sure physics is working. And another guy right over here. Okay, might want to zoom in and just pixel snap to the ground. Okay, cool. So let's hit play. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to left click and select one of these guys in the inspector. So let's search for invader. Okay, what are they actually called in this scene? Let's see, enemy 2 and enemy 3. So I probably want to go to the invader scene and rename those to be invader. Okay, so on the object sets, so to make it easier to see it in the inspector, among other things, let's actually export the current health value as well. So now if we hit play and we shoot a guy and we go to Hurtbox stats, we can see the current health there. So we can see that setting the max health to the current health didn't work. So I would just go into object stats and let's manually set the current health to 100. If you spawn a new enemy into the game, then after you spawn, you can just set the current health equal to the max health, whatever the max health is, if you want them to be fully healthy. Inside of our level 1, of course, let's make sure that these are called invader, invader 2, and invader 3. So if you just type invader, it'll automatically assign the number after it. Okay, now we can go back into play mode. We can shoot our little guy there, and the Hurtbox will be able to see the stats. Okay, so we hit play, and let's shoot again, and let's see if the damage was assigned to the current health. Okay, it's not showing there in the object stats. So to show that the character is going to take damage, let's put a print message here, and then we'll print the current health of the stats on the Hurtbox whenever we deal damage to it. Also, one thing I probably think we should do is go in here and change this to an export var and not have the equals health thing. That is just going to have it set to 0. Resources work a little bit differently than nodes, where they don't automatically have like a on ready where they set everything when you launch a scene, like a node would, but rather I think you have to manually set these values. So if we default this to 100, then the character's current health will be 100 whenever it's created. In your node scripts, you can have something like when the player character or the enemy is spawned into the scene, you just on ready, and then you set the current health equals to the max health. But you would do that through a node, not a resource. So that's one of the limitations here. Technically, you can also use the init function to probably do that, but I think that might be a little bit more messy. And it's probably better to modify these values with the node script than try to set them in the resource script itself. Okay, so anyway, when we hit the Hurtbox stats, it's going to show the current health inside of the console. So let's shoot at one of these guys. We can see on every hit, it takes 10 damage. We can also go over here for a bit. So that's all well and good. Now we can see that the character can drop below 0 health. So what we probably want to do is when a character drops to 0 health, that they are going to enter the death state and no longer be hittable. So that's what we'll work on in the next video, having a character become immune to damage and changing its animation state from walking and moving around to the death state.